situation. I went on to another farm and picked up an ear of corn from a fella, and this is what he had. He'd already fed it up. It was all gone, but this is what he had. I asked him what happened to him, and he says, well, I forgot to put any phosphate on. So here's no phosphate, here's no potash. Well, you have to give this guy credit. He did straighten up the cob, didn't he?
This is Frank Boyd, an agronomist, a missionary, a farmer and a teacher who has shown thousands of farmers how to make more money, how to make their acres produce bigger and better quality crops. His story is the fertilizer story, and he tells it like it's never been told before. This is farmland, land that Preacher Frank has lived for and worked for all of his life. It could be your land, and from its soil you derive the means to get bread for your family's table, clothes for its back, education for its mind. You must cherish your land, take care of it, make it work for you. But how? Ever since the days when he worked his own farm near Boyd's Tank, Alabama, Preacher Frank has been showing and telling farmers how. For doing this, he has been acclaimed by farm people everywhere. A National Farm magazine recently cited him as Man of the Year for service to agriculture. A Plant Food Educational Society made him an honorary lifetime member. And Auburn University, his alma mater, conferred upon him the Algernon Sidney Sullivan Award in recognition of his heart, his mind, and his conduct that have always shown a spirit of love and helpfulness to others. Look and listen now as Preacher Frank addresses a group of farm people, people much like yourselves, who cherish their land and depend for their livelihood on the fruits of its soil.
Our yields have been so low and our cost of production so high that there's been very little profit. In fact, we just about get up to the break-even level. But under this scheme that we'll try to tell you about, we're going to do a better job. If you were sick, of course, you'd call a good doctor. If you had legal troubles, you get your lawyer. If you have financial troubles, you go to see your banker. If your conscience hurts you, you call on your preacher. And if you have fertility problems, you'll have to go to the experiment station in the several states to find the answer. We are interested in all this because they have the information, and we would like to find out what it takes to get it used by farmers. As I travel around among the land-grant colleges and the county agents throughout the country, I have picked up a handful of bulletins. I have found, for instance, a bulletin on cotton production, one on peanut production, one on tobacco, and another one on rice, and one on pastures, and one on silage, and one on hay and winter grazing, and then there's one on small grains, one on alfalfa, and one on Sudan and millet, one on grain sorghums, and there's one on Bermuda grass. We have to do that job frequently now, is to get interested in a new crop, and that crop is Bermuda grass. We have one on soybeans. They have bulletins about sweet potatoes and pecans and home orchards and fruits. And then we have a set of bulletins that deal with the plant nutrition. We have a bulletin that teaches us about phosphorus and potash and nitrogen. Then we have a bulletin from the experiment station that tells us about the lime and the sulfur and the magnesium. And then they have bulletins that tell us about the minor elements, boron and iron and manganese and zinc and copper and molybdenum. Then we have bulletins also about fish ponds. The folks at the experiment stations figured we'd lay by sooner or later, so they've given us a bulletin on fish ponds, how to build them, how to stock them, how to fatten them, how to make them easy to catch. And at this session here today, we want to ask people if they thought all of our customers and people like that were interested in this kind of information as a source of information to do a better job farming. And they tell me that practically everybody in this group today is interested, and they look to that as a source of information, but there might be a couple of fellows in the crowd, they told me, that wouldn't follow that kind of information. So I brought along a latest birthday almanac for those fellas. That's a big job, but that's a lot of reading to do. Most of our agricultural workers don't take time off to read all this, and the county agents don't have time to read all that. So we've urged the college to really brief that stuff up so we'll have all we need to know in one little leaflet. In other words, they have published all the fertilizer information in a leaflet no more than this. They have all the crops we grow, all the fertilizers we make, and how much to put down to get the crops we want. But if you'll notice that the title of this bulletin is General Fertilizer Recommendations. General recommendations. Well, I tell you, in this modern day of farming, we can't depend on the general plan any longer. In other words, your fertilizer that you ought to use is in that bulletin somewhere, but how are you going to find it? So what we're trying to do is reduce that even further. That's still too much reading to get the information we want. So for the purpose of this meeting, I have put all the information we have that we need to know, that you farmers need to know, on the backs of 3 fertilizer sacks. The way that we find out about that is that the station tells us, experiment stations tell us, that one of these ratios will fit any crop we grow. In other words, you need a fertilizer that's high in phosphate and low in potash, or you need one that's equal in phosphate and potash, or you need one that's low in phosphate and high in potash. We've set off the example grades here. In other words, 16 is high and 8 is low. 16 down to 8, 20 down to 10. Over here it's equal fertilizers, equal phosphorus and potash, like 8-8 and 10-10 and 12-12 and 14-14. Over here we go the opposite to this one over here. It's low phosphorus and high potash, 8 up to 16, 9 up to 27. That certainly simplifies our story, but even now, after reducing it from all this pile of stuff down through this bulletin, finally getting it on the backs of 3 fertilizer sacks, then we must know, of course, which one of these bags to use. Which fertilizer shall I use on my farm? Shall I use a high-low deal or an equal P and K deal? Do I need extra potash in a deal like that bag over there? In other words, we have it all worked out, but we just got to make one more decision. Which bag shall I buy for my crops on my farm? And there's only one answer to that. We'll have to get our soils tested. The soil test simply points out which one of these bags fits the field from which you sent a sample. If you take a soil sample and test it in the laboratory, and they'll tell you it's either this one or this one or this one. We must have a soil test to finally decide which one of these bags is ours. Which one fits the red field, which one fits the gray field, which one suits the hill land, and which one suits the bottom land. So that's our story, and that's the way we're going to present it to you, is that you'll have to use one of these fertilizers, general ratios, with this several grades under each ratio, but it's always high-low, equal, and low-high. Well, what about the soil test? How do you get a soil test made? If you send a soil sample to the laboratory to be tested, they check for your phosphate, they check the potash, and they check the lime. 3 things. That's all the things we have in this that we're involved in. The phosphate, the potash, and the lime. What happens when you send a sample? He tests it and comes back and says, you are high in phosphate, but you're low in potash. That's a high-low situation in the soil. So what kind of fertilizer would you use in a case like that? Well, if the soil is high-low, you use a fertilizer just the opposite of that, which is low-high. In other words, you have a high-low situation in the soil, and the other opposite of that in the fertilizer, and the 2 together balances it up. In other words, if you have this kind of a situation in the soil, this kind in the fertilizer, then the poor crop gets it like this. In other words, that's what we're after, is a balanced fertilizer for the crop. I've seen some of your soil tests, and it shows sometimes you may get one that's low in phosphorus and low in potash. Both of them are low. In other words, you have an equal situation now, low, but you don't have much of it. So what do? We simply add enough fertility to raise the low up through medium on up to high. Then if you test another soil and it comes back medium, about half enough, then you just add enough fertilizer to get it up to high. And if you happen to be fortunate enough to send a sample to the laboratory that comes back high, then what do? Well, being in the kind of business I'm in, I suggest you put on a little anyhow. In other words, it's from low to medium to high, and that's what we'll have to get. It works like this. Here's a soil that's low in plant food. This is a plant food situation, low. It's leveled off now, but not much of it. So what do? You simply add enough plant food to fill it full so you can get a good yield. That's the object in this whole story. Here's another one when the soil is about 2/3 full, a sort of a medium situation. Then what do? Just add enough plant food to get it up to high. Then you can make a good crop on that land. Here's one that's already high. But what do? It'll hold a little too, as you notice. In other words, we're going to have some fertilizer on all soils. No soil is so good that it doesn't need a start of fertilizer. So that's the way it works as we test the soils. It's from low to medium to high. The same for phosphate, the potash, and the lime. And it's out of that situation that we finally arrive at this bag situation that I showed to you. In other words, we want to find out whether we are low or medium or high in plant food and how much we'll have to add to get it up to the proper level to make the kind of corn and cotton and peanuts and crops that we need. In other words, for this occasion, I stopped at a farm down the road to get an ear of corn to demonstrate with. I stopped at a farm and asked him for an ear of corn, and that's all he gave me. I said, what happened to you? He said, well, I found out too late that I didn't put any potash in the fertilizer, and this is the kind of corn you get. In other words, he just didn't make any corn. Little old nubbin that the grains were short, and the yield was short, and the profit just wasn't any profit at all. No potash. That's a bad situation. I went on to another farm and picked up an ear of corn from a fella, and this is what he had. He'd already fed it up. It was all gone, but this is what he had. I asked him what happened to him, and he says, well, I forgot to put any phosphate on. So here's no phosphate, here's no potash. Well, you have to give this guy credit. He did straighten up the cob, didn't he? He's got the thing under control. Then I finally went to another farm, asking for an ear of corn, and the fellow gave me this. I said, man, how on earth do you do that? He said, well, I'll tell you what. I had my soil tested, and I did what the man said do and prayed for rain, and that's what I got. It's the same old story. You got to find out what you need and add it to get the kind of yields you want. In other words, here's a little ear of corn that didn't have any potash. Here's one that didn't have any phosphate. And here's one that didn't have any nitrogen. Bad specimen, just nubbins. And here's on that poor land. And here's one that got all three of them, and it does a better job. And of course, if he had used Harvest King, this is what he would have. In other words, you have to go after this thing and find out what it takes and add all of it, from no potash, no phosphate, no nitrogen, all three of them, then all three plus Harvest King kind of fertilizer. It'll make that kind of a yield for you, and we can make money farming. In the cotton belt, I have seen a lot of farms where it takes 5 or 6 acres to make a bale of cotton. But that's not much profit. It takes 5 or 6 acres to make a bale. Now, no fellow will stay in the cotton business unless he's making about a bale per acre. But if you'll do all the things that your local county agent tells you to do about growing cotton now, he'll tell all about the preparation and the cultivation and the fumigation and the rotation and the mechanization and the pesticides and the what have you. And when you add all that up, you have spent a bale of cotton. In other words, it takes about a bale of cotton to pay the cost of production, and that's why so many folks now are shooting for 2 bales to the acre. One to pay expenses and one for the profit. And that's a job that's before all of us, and that's the one we're working on. The thing that makes this go is that you have to have your soil and your fertilizer balanced up properly. In other words, we'll call this one soil and call this one fertilizer. Let's get them together some way so they would be a good smooth flow. Well, that's a tongue and groove deal, and if you get the tongue in the groove, you have a nice smooth board, and that's what we would have in a fertilizer situation. The soil and the fertilizer must match up like a tongue and groove board. Or you must have your soil and your fertilizer matching or fitting like a hand and a glove. If they don't match and they don't fit, then your yields are going to come up short. because you're not getting to it just right. This glove will not fit this hand. I have a glove for that hand. In other words, you got to get the one that fits to match up properly, as I showed you on the board. And if you get that, we'll have the kind of yields we want. Another thing, many of you people have been on your vacations and ride up through the mountains and pass through a tunnel on the highway or on the train. Do you know how they dig a tunnel? Well, they put a crew on this side of the mountain and another crew on this side, and they start digging. They just keep digging, and they keep digging, and keep digging. And if they meet, of course, you got a tunnel. In other words, it fits like that. The man building a tunnel has got to get the crew on this side and the crew on this side to come together. And if they miss or don't come together, what do you have? You got two tunnels. In other words, we can't make this thing if we're guessing at it and miscalculating. We got to get them together, make them fit like that. And that's the way we'll get the yields we want. Here's two magnets. I'll show you another way it works. These are good magnets. They'll pick up a hammer. They're strong. Here's one that'll pick up this big knife over here. They're strong magnets, and they're real good. But let's see what they'll do to each other. Let's see if they'll attract each other like that. So I'll put them on this board so you can see, and I'll see what they'll do. No, it's going to push them off the board. They're not matched properly. Let's try this one. Oh, no, it won't work. They are not matched either. Let's turn this one over and see what happens. They come together when you match them up, and they hold on so tight you can't get them apart. That's what we must do with our soils and our fertilizers, get them matched up properly, and then we can get the yields that we're looking for. If they don't match, you're going to have to be satisfied with a nubbin. There's no way to get it but that way. So as we plug away at this thing and try to get all these jobs done, then we're going to have the job that we want in our profit end of the angle. I've been talking about phosphate and potash and getting them balanced up. That whole story was about a balancing act for phosphorus and potash. But nitrogen also has to get in the fertilizer, has to be applied. Nitrogen is the thing that makes grass green, makes crops grow, makes corn green, makes yields up. We have to have the nitrogen. And if we don't have nitrogen, then even though we have the other balance, it's like your oil and the water in your car. You get them balanced up properly, but it takes gas to make the car move. And that's what that nitrogen does to us. When I left down at my home to come up here to this meet with you people, I pulled in a service station, and a woman right ahead of me told the man she wanted 2 gallons. And the fellow on the other side wanted 5 gallons. And when I got up there, he says, "How much do you want?" I said, "Man, fill it up and run it over. I'm headed for way away from here. I've got a 1,000-mile trip ahead of me. So fill it up and run it over. I'm on my way." And it's the same way with our crops. If we don't do that, we'll never make it. This field of corn, when I went to look it over and asked the farmer about how his yields turned out, and he said I didn't do so good. I said, "What on earth could have happened to that corn?" He says it gave out a gas. Right in the middle of the summer, it gave out a nitrogen, which is the gas in corn production. He just couldn't make it. But I got an ear of his corn, and here it is. You notice it started off like a house of fire, putting on corn, but when the gas gave out, when the nitrogen quit, it didn't put on another grain. In other words, we have to feed it to go all the way. You have to put enough to finish the job. And that's what we're up against in this nitrogen game, or any part of the fertilizers for that. You've got enough to accomplish your aims, and that's the way it works. Now, as I've been talking about phosphate and potash, and now I have told you about the value of nitrogen in this thing, well, of course, if you have the best fertilizer in the world and it meets all the requirements and is used according to soil tests, then if the soil is sour or too sour, the fertilizers do not function properly. So this lime that I've been telling you about has to be checked too. The lime can be low or medium or high. And the man tells you all about it when he tests the soil. He says it's too low, you'll have to put on lime for certain crops. If it's medium, it'll fit some crops. And if it's high, it'll fit other crops. So we have to have sweet or necessarily sweet or slightly acid soils to do the best job. On the extremes, that is too low and too high, we run in trouble with our crops and with our fertilizer. We just have to check all the things that go into production if we're going to make a good profit farming. Well, it's nice to have all of it balanced up properly, but you know what happens? A lot of our farmers just don't want to go all out. They just do some of the things. He's still hanging on to some of his granddaddy's ideas about how to make corn and so on and make other crops. The other day I read a story about a man who was an expert at throwing a boomerang. Finally, he saw in the paper where he could get a new one. Somebody's invented one still better. So he ordered the new one, and then he ran himself nuts trying to throw his old one away. You just can't keep on and hold on to those old ones. You'll have to get rid of them, and in a lot of cases, we're going to have to dig a hole and bury them. You just can't throw them away. It's not that easy. But if we're going to shoot for the moon, if we're trying to make this kind of yields and make this 2 bales of cotton and a ton of peanuts and a ton of tobacco and tons of hay and tons of everything, we'll just have to go all out, and that all out may mean something in addition to lime and nitrogen and phosphorus and potash. And those other elements, I mentioned them a while ago. They are boron and zinc and manganese and copper and iron and so forth. Well, if we don't use them, we're just missing the boat when we're shooting for such high yields. In other words, we're going to have not only our old regular fertilizers, which contain nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash, and calcium and magnesium and sulfur, we're going to have to switch to Harvest King, which has all this has, plus Vital. In other words, this Vital is a combination of all those minor elements that I mentioned, including molybdenum. Just what it does to it, I'm not so sure, but they tell me you have to have a pinch of it if you make the grade. We're going to have to shoot for the moon, and that's what we do with Harvest King. We're not satisfied with 1 bale or 40 bushels of corn or a half a ton of anything. We want to go all out to get it, and that's what we're up against. It works like this. Here's a little Boy Scout knife. Belongs to my grandson. It has 8 gadgets on it. Knives and scissors and saws and bottle openers and corkscrews and can openers and what have you. And my little grandson wouldn't dare go out on a Boy Scout overnight trip without his knife. He has to have it. So I asked him on one day when he came back, I said, son, you didn't use all of those gadgets you had on your knife. He said, oh, no, I didn't use them all, but I didn't know which one I was going to need, so I took them all along. Those Boy Scouts figure out it's better to have them and not need them than to need one of them and not have it if you're shooting for high yield. You have to go all out. Our cattlemen are doing the same kind of a deal. All back in the old days, we used to just feed common salt to cattle. Now we're feeding mineralized salt to cattle. Did you ever drive by a pasture and see cows licking salt where both of them were available? They all congregated around the one with the minerals in it. I don't know just which ones you wanted, but since there was something in there you had to have. And that's the kind of deal we have up against when we get all this thing worked out. And that's the same way with our fertilizers. For the man who's going all out to make the most profit with the biggest yields, we're going to have everything we've always had, plus Vital, which adds up to that much stuff. We got to do it to win the battle. You can't do it any other way. And the way to win this battle, of course, is we'll have to get our soils tested. You can't guess at it any longer. You'll have to go. So when you people leave this meeting and you go out on the streets and on the roads and the highways back home, every fellow you meet from there out, don't say good morning Jones or good morning Smith or good morning Jim, good morning. Just ask him when you see him if he's had his soils tested. Keep asking, everybody. And the first thing you know, everybody in this whole area will get the soils tested. And if we do, we'll be making these kind of yields. You have to get a soil test. You can't do it any other way. So when you go to church Sunday, don't say good morning preacher. Just ask him if he's had his soils tested. And the soil testing will bring another $1 million or $2 million and sometimes $3 million extra money into a county by just having your soil tested and getting the job done. And when that preacher hears about that extra $1 million coming in, he'll preach 2 sermons on these jobs that we're talking about here. It's one of those things that you have to get everybody working at if you do a good job. I went by the courthouse this morning and talked to the county judge. And I told him about what we were going to do here today. And they said, well, I believe we could help you a little bit. And I says, how is that? He says, you know, a lot of people come in here to get married, so we're not going to marry another couple unless they've had the soil tested. We'll have to have a soil test to win this battle. And if you get a soil test, it'll point out to you what ratio you should use. And then if you're going full force, way ahead of your neighbors, you'll have to use Harvest King to get the job done. Let me give you a little problem there. I'm afraid you haven't quite caught on to what I'm trying to get at on this profit deal. In other words, if you put down on your notebook there any figure, but any number between 1 and 10, just any number. Now double that number. Now add 10 to that number. Now divide by 2. Now subtract from what you have that original number that you thought of. Well, of course, I don't have the slightest idea which number you thought of in the beginning, but I can tell you that your answer is 5. The answer is always 5. So when we get into this fertilizer business, it doesn't matter where you start from, whether you're on gray land or red land or north or south or east or west. We have all starting where we are, but we must all arrive at the same answer, and that's profit. And I'll show you how it works on the board. If the yield is up high, the cost of producing the corn or cotton or peanuts or tobacco or hay or what have you is down low. The object of getting high yield is to reduce the cost. But if the yield slips and starts downward, you see what happens to the cost. It goes up and up and up and up as the yields come down. But if you want to get your costs down, you'll have to raise the yields up. And if we can keep a situation like that with high yields and low costs, then, of course, there is profit in farming, and that's the only way we can get the profit, is to have this spread wide enough from between the yield and the cost of production so that there is some room for profit, and that's the way we get it. In other words, the whole story, after all, adds up to profit, and the only way to make profit is to get a good yield, and the only way to get good yields is to have your soil tested and follow instructions. And if you want high yields, put on enough to make high yields. So after all these years of working at this deal and preaching this story, this is my philosophy. Early to bed and early to rise, work like hell and fertilize.